Shrewsbury Armouries small swords. Are these the ones you've been looking for? Let's find out. Hi, I'm Nick Thomas and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. And in this video I'm going to give you a breakdown of the Shrewsbury Armouries small swords. Full disclosure, I bought this first one from them. I then had a second given to me as a free tester, which has gone to one of my students, and I then bought this one, the third one, with my own money again. So I have bought them before and after being given that free tester. So, you know, I'm not going to shill for Shrewsbury. I'm going to give you an honest take. I've given lots of feedback to them. Let's get going. So Shrewsbury Armouries are UK made, which is absolutely fantastic. There haven't been many UK made small sword options over the years, a few sort of custom bits and castings and stuff, but not just regularly, sort of pretty much off the shelf, readily available small swords in the UK. And, you know, across the world, there have been some real dry spells for small swords. We're actually living in a bit of a golden age right now, so there's a lot more options than there used to be. But it's really nice to see a UK-made supplier. So if you're in the UK, you can get these easily. And if you go to UK events, of course, like Fight Camp and Skirmish, Gathering of Wolves, Mike Pitt often has, that's the guy who runs Shrewsbury, he often has a stall there where you can just buy the swords, handle them, whatever. So they're very, very readily available. And you can always just message him and get one, you know, sent to you by mail anyway. So they're quite readily available, sort of in stock a lot of the time, which is something you don't see with a lot of HEMA swords. Now, before I do go into an in-depth review on the Shrewsbury, let me just say, if you don't currently practice small sword, please give it a go. I can't guarantee you'll like it, but I'd bet good money you will. Even the most die-hard longsworders, when you give them a small sword and let them have a go, they actually have fun. So even if you're not interested in, you know, 18th century swords or small sword, you probably will have a lot of fun with the small sword. It'll teach you a lot about point control, it'll improve your mechanics generally in terms of tightening down your movements, and it's a nice lightweight bit of fun when you don't want to, you know, be having heavy gear on and smashing away at each other. So the vast majority of people that give small sword a try both improve from it and have a lot of fun doing it. So please, you know, please go and try it. I do really recommend it. Back onto the Shrewsbury. So I first handled them something like 2.5 years ago, and then I bought my first one, which is this one, about 1.5 years ago. And this is a really funky hilt with its big wide quillons. That's, you know, not the kind of thing you typically see with small sword. Most people practicing small sword are doing what we'd call a kind of French style small sword. This one is designed after an example shown in the 17th century German manual of Langer's. Now that, of course, is quite an early period for the small sword, because most people, again, are practicing 18th century small sword. But yes, small swords were coming in the late 17th century. And so this is a really cool, funky example. In fact, I might map this up with a longer blade to make it a little bit kind of that transitional at some point. But anyway, this is what I had. And overall, I liked it. There were a few little things which I thought could be improved. Early on, his hilts were a little bit larger, a little bit heavy, and the grips were a little bit long. And that resulted in not just kind of a larger, bulkier hilt than I would like generally, is that the balance was brought quite a way back. Now, there is a tendency within some small sworders to go with very hilt-heavy small swords. I'm really not a fan of that. And the reason for that is twofold. One, I want my small swords to handle like the originals. And two, I like a bit more blade presence for kind of centerline blade domination, which is the way that the styles generally are supposed to work. Now, if you look at to either side of me here, I've got 4 antique small swords. So yes, I do collect small swords as well, antiques. So I do know a lot about their handling. And I've handled many more than just these 4 here. And you can see a selection of blade examples here. We'll talk about them in a bit, but you've got triangular cross sections, you've got calichamade, you've got double-edged stuff, like a lenticular construction there as well. So we'll talk about those and compare them to these and why I necessarily like certain handling characteristics as we go along. In terms of the blade on these, small sword is one of those few training swords where we don't tend to talk a lot about the blades because they're just interchangeable with any of the sport blades you want. So you can mount any épée blade. In theory, you could mount a foil blade, a sport saver blade, a musketeer blade. Anything with that kind of square tang construction could go straight into this, and any manufacturer anywhere in the world. So we don't tend to talk about that much, although Shrewsbury is using the Excalibur blades on these, which are one of my personal favourites. So these are available in the UK very cheap. And that's £32 per blade. It's a very, very cheap blade. That's not the only reason I like them. The other reason is that they're a little bit heavier and a little bit stiffer than a lot of other épées, for example, from PBT or Leon Paul, which are very good manufacturers. But with these small swords, I like a bit more weight, a little bit more blade presence. That's my preference, and this is sort of like a halfway between an épée and a musketeer blade. The musketeer is like a double wide épée, and they can come out a little bit too stiff at times, so they can be a little bit brutal in terms of flex. Whereas these, they still flex largely like an épée, but they handle, you know, a little bit beefier, like a lot of the originals that I like. Now, in terms of original small swords, you're going to find, as with any sword, a broad spectrum of specification. They can come in weight ranges from down to 350 grams and sometimes even a bit lighter, all the way up to kind of 700 grams. But a typical small sword is in about the 400 to 500 gram weight range, roughly speaking, okay? So these two from Shrewsbury, they are both 500 grams. This one's just over, is about 510, and this one's just under, it's about 495, something like that. So that puts them in a good weight range. Now, obviously, these hilts are beefed up compared to the original. So if you look at original small sword hilts, they are really, really kind of dainty and slender, and that is not really well suited to practice as an actual regular martial art. As with a lot of original sword hilts, they don't necessarily stand up to a lot of abuse if you're using them, you know, week in, week out. Training swords tend to be built just a bit tougher so they can withstand that abuse, as opposed to something you'd wear in real life only needs to, you know, withstand a few fights. And so, yeah, roughly 500 grams, although that weight is nicely distributed. So the balance here is, you know, on this one is, you know, looking around about 7 or 8 centimeters from the shell, which is kind of perfect. Again, a lot of small swords today, they kind of balance all the way in the shells or even further back at the quillen area, which I really don't like. The original swords, you look at my originals, they mostly balance between about 5 and 10 centimeters from the shells. So this one is absolutely perfect. This one is one of Shrewsbury's earlier swords, and it balances just a little bit closer to the shells, again, because it's that larger hilt, although, again, they have downsized that a little bit. Also note the pommel. The early examples all use these kind of machine component part threaded dome pommels, which they look okay, but they're kind of hard to tighten because they're just, you know, smooth. Whereas now Shrewsbury's gone on to turn in their own pommels, which just looks so much more beautiful, more like the original swords, feels nicer, and is easier to tighten up and disassemble. So that's a big improvement. Now, in terms of the scale generally, I mean, these aren't quite equivalent models, of course, because they're designed to represent different kinds of small swords, but this gives you an idea of scale. They were much larger back then, and he's reduced the size of the shells, he's reduced the size of the anelets, the rings here, the quillen block has downsized, the grip length has downsized, so everything has just become that much more compact, which brings it closer to the original swords and also pushes that balance a little bit further forward in a way that feels so much better. So looking at the hilt here, you can see that the shells are kind of you know, laser cut or similar process, and then shaped, rounded, formed quite nicely. They're really tough and really pretty. I haven't had any issues with them whatsoever. They're nice and tough. The actual, what we call the core, or you could call this the ricasso in some swords, but the core of the small sword is all steel, really strong, feels nice. And this block here, the core block, or ricasso again with some swords, ricasso as if it was uncovered, so we call this a core in small sword, is flat, which is absolutely fantastic, because in small sword you want to put the thumb on that section, okay? As if you're, you know, using your TV remote with the thumb. That wants to be flat to be comfortable, and if it's round, it kind of turns and is irritating, so that's kind of perfect. So a typical French grip small sword, we grip something like this, where the index finger rests across the rings or the anelets, and the thumb presses down onto the core or ricasso type block. And that feels absolutely fantastic. Now onto the grip shape. So, small swords have a few issues with their grips of turning, and this one is actually turning, this early model. And the reason they turn is because the tang in a small sword type blade, a sport type blade, is only square for a small part and then is round, just threaded all the way after that. Whereas most swords would have a rectangular tang so that the grip will not turn on it whatsoever. This can be solved in a few different ways. In fact, most manufacturers just don't bother, and they just expect you to make sure it's nice and tight and hope that it doesn't turn, which is not ideal, okay? This has been solved in the Shrewsbury by having this square lug. So this lug drops down into the guard section, and therefore stops it rotating. Now this 3D printed type grip, that square lug can sometimes break, although ultimately, this is a kind of consumable part. You could just buy a replacement from them, or you could redo the lug yourself. Or, I mean, this one did eventually break, but it kind of still compresses together quite nicely and doesn't actually turn whatsoever, even when it's slightly loose. And this one's now had a lot of use. So it's kind of one of those minor issues. It's nice that the effort's been put into trying to stop it turning, because your grips, you don't really want completely round grips either, is that most original sword grips are some type of oval to stop it turning, and these are oval grips. And if you have an oval grip that's allowed to turn, it gets really weird. So this is an oval grip that doesn't turn, works really, really well. So notice if I compare them to some originals, you'll see that the shells on many originals are actually tiny. Now this is actually at the smaller end. There's variety. They do get a bit bigger than this, but overall, most small swords have very, very small shells. And you notice this HEMA one is just a little bit larger, a good chunk larger. Not to the level it's unrealistic, but does give that little bit more hand protection, which is, nice to see, because in small sword we tend to wear just, light gloves, sport fencing or similar type gloves. So, hand thrusts can be a bit brutal. So this kind of, it nicely represents the original. It's not overdone. It's not like an épée cup or something, but it gives a little bit of hand protection at the same time. And in terms of weight, so this one is a 450 gram small sword, although again, it's a little bit shorter. So this is mounted with a size 5 épée blade. So it's a few inches longer than this antique, and the balance is basically the same. This Kalishamard, 450 grams. Again, it's a whisker shorter because this is a size 5. If you want to put a size 2 on your small sword to be more like a French small sword, because French small swords overall were typically short, I prefer the size 5 because it's kind of a good standardized product and it tends to have better mass distribution and kind of weight in the blade, whereas if you go with size 2s, they can just get a little bit flimsy. So I do use the 2s as well, but my preference is just to stick with 5s because they handle so much more like the originals, even though they're a bit, a few inches longer than a typical French small sword. And so here we have a boat shell double-edged small sword. This one's actually 540 grams. So as I said, small swords, they can get quite beefy. And this one balances a little bit further forward than the Shrewsbury. And finally, a lenticular blade construction. This is 510 grams. So again, double-edged. The shells are a little bit larger, you can see, compared to, or a little bit larger than some of the antiques. But you can still see the Shrewsbury is still a little bit larger on the shells, but again, not excessively so, I don't think so, not for a training sword. And in terms of the kind of overall grip length, hilt length, okay, they're kind of pretty much perfect. So if you have too long a grip on a small sword, it tends to interfere with the wrist and it just gets quite irritating. So to sum up the Shrewsbury small swords, what do I think? Well, I think they're actually absolutely fantastic. And generally speaking now, I only ever carry the Shrewsbury in my fencing bag and the Pink Mass, which are, the 3D printed stainless steel hilts. I carry those two as my kind of go-to swords because I like them, they're dependable, and I like the way they handle. So those are my kind of go-to. So with this one, you're getting a British-made product, which is absolutely great if you're in the UK or if you're visiting UK events. So they're readily available, easy to get, generally in stock. They handle now fantastically in terms of the weight and balance is a very accurate representation of many small swords. Although again, if you wanted different specification, because he offers different hilts, pommels, and blade lengths and types, you could put up whatever you want on it and bring that weight balance up or down as you please. This is a really good standard. I think they look really pretty. They're proving comfortable to use. They are tough. With these new turned pommels, you can very easily dismantle, change blades, tighten up, absolutely perfect. So is there anything bad to say about these? Actually, no. The fantastic thing with Shrewsbury Armouries is they've taken on a lot of feedback over the last couple of years and they just keep improving them. And this one now that I bought in March of this year, so this is roughly 6 months of use, is kind of perfect to what I want. So I'm at the point now where I wouldn't necessarily recommend any more changes because this one's just nailing what I want. Of course, if you want a knuckle bow, he sells them with knuckle bows, you can have that, that's absolutely fine. I'm a huge fan of knuckle bowless small swords. I think they just look fantastic. I kind of appreciate the way that handling works, so you're not getting necessarily pulled in any way with the knuckle bow. It's a minor detail, but it's just for me. I like this style. So yeah, the current price, this one was about £210, which is, it's a fair price for a really nice product, and I just can't recommend these enough now. If you want to get into small sword, this is a fantastic option for you. You can have it quickly and easily, you can depend on it. Go and grab them. I'll put the links in the description to Shrewsbury Armouries where you can go and buy them. I would highly recommend that you do. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please get Smallsword in and like and subscribe if you haven't already.